Welcome to this Plough magazine event, The Case for One More Child, Why Large Families Will Save Humanity. And I'm joined here tonight with Ross Douthat, Sarah C. Williams, Leah Libresco Sargeant, and Louie Sussman. And we'll get full bios in a moment. I'm Peter Mommsen. I'm the editor of Plough Quarterly. For those new to Plough, we're a magazine of faith, culture, and society. We publish stories, graphic novels, essays, even sometimes plays, and I welcome you to check us out online. I'm so glad so many of you are joining us this evening. We're looking forward to a probing and many-faceted discussion on a hugely important issue. It's not often we get to talk about a question on which the future of humanity may quite literally depend. So this evening showcases the launch of Plough's new issue, What Are Families For? I'm just going to show that here, which contains many articles, but one among them is an article by Ross Douthat entitled The Case for One More Child. And obviously, tonight we're going to be talking about that article. It features many other contributions, including wonderful pieces from two of our panelists, Leah Libresco and Sarah Williams. So before we get too much farther, I do urge you, please subscribe. Plough, that's how we spell it. Check out our website if you'd like to learn more about our future events. You can sign up for those. We'd like to thank our co-sponsors too, Other Feminisms, a Substack community, and Breaking Ground, an online journalism project in response to the crisis of the present. It's from the Cardis Institute, Comment Magazine, and Plough Magazine. So we look forward to an event night like this several times a year, and we're looking forward, especially this year, to having a celebration like this in person. We are committed to doing in-person events as soon as we can do that responsibly. But for now, in a time that is so difficult for many, we thought it would be wonderful at least to get together like this online as a way of being together and continuing the conversations that happen in the pages of Plough and some of the other publications I mentioned. So a few technical notes at the beginning. We'll drop links to any articles or resources referred to in the YouTube chat feature as we go along. And you too can type your questions and comments into YouTube chat. We will plan to get to an audience Q&A toward the end. So please feel free to type those in just as the talks or conversation goes along and as they occur to you. And we'll collect those and I will pose those to the panel then in the Q&A section, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. So we're going to move to the substance of our evening, and let me start by introducing our main speaker, Ross Douthat. Well known to many, he's a columnist for the New York Times, the author of several books, most recently, The Decadent Society, How We Became the Victims of Our Own Success, came out last year with Simon & Schuster. His other books include To Change the Church, Pope Francis, and the Future of Catholicism, Bad Religion, How We Became a Nation of Heretics, Privilege, Harvard and the Education of the Ruling Class in 2005, and his co-author with Rian Salam, A Grand New Party, How Republicans Can Win the Working Class and Save the American Dream, back in 2008. He is a film critic for the National Review, and he lives with his wife and 4 children in New Haven. And Ross, you've written one of the most hotly debated articles that Plough has published. Why do you think there is a case for one more child?
Well, first, thank you so much, Peter, both for giving me the opportunity to write at length in the pages of Plough and also for putting this event together. And I'm really grateful to Leah and Anna and Sarah for joining as well. And I also want to add my voice to your recommendation for the entire issue of your quarterly, which is filled with fascinating articles, some of them perhaps even more fascinating than my own, even if my own maybe has the most provocative or, depending on your point of view, annoying title. So I guess what I was doing in the piece is trying to sort of pull one thread out of this incredibly tangled question. The question being, why in rich countries, basically the world over, is the human race apparently not reproducing itself anymore? Meaning not literally that people aren't having any more children, but that below replacement fertility is the norm in just about every wealthy country in the world. It has been for some time. The birth rate is dropping pretty much all over. It's scraping stark lows in countries like South Korea, Finland, and elsewhere. And no one is quite sure why. Obviously, you can sort of point to specific things. The Great Recession caused a dip in the birth rate. The pandemic year is going to probably cause a substantial dip in the birth rate, people reacting to crises and material circumstances. But overall, you have a scenario where the world is in theory richer and more comfortable than ever before. And people continue to say that they want to have more children than they're actually having. So there's this sort of persistent, somewhat widened and chronic gap between desired fertility for both men and women and how many kids people actually have, which was the jumping off point, I believe, for Anna's terrific essay on some of these themes in the pages of the newspaper for which I work most of the time, the New York Times. So this is sort of the question, right? Why is this happening? And it's rather important that it's happening because it has implications for all kinds of issues: economic growth, political reform, relations between the generations, basic human happiness, human fulfillment, the ability of people to have what seems like a pretty basic human good, the ability to have the number of children you want to have. And so my essay sort of starts actually with this really arresting, if maybe not totally convincing, study that came out recently on car seats and the cost of car seats. And the authors of the paper argue that regulations around car seats, the requirements that kids have these sort of huge hulking captain's chair on Star Trek style seats in the back of the car, and that you have to have one not just when you're a baby, but all the way up to 8 or 9 or 12 years old. This creates this kind of, Leah can correct me on like the mathematical, it's not like a fractal, it's some sort of break point in a decision tree or something. I'm just making up terms here now, where it becomes actually harder for people to go, especially from 2 kids to 3 kids, because you literally have to buy a new car. You can't have 3 children under a certain age in the back of a mid-size American sedan anymore. And you certainly can't stuff them in the way people did with jalopies in the 1940s or something. And so the authors of this paper argue that this explains some particular percentage of sort of America's fertility deficit. And I don't think you have to necessarily buy their particular statistical analysis to see that there is this interesting piece of the puzzle here, right? Which is that there really are, a certain number of people who sort of waver between 1 child or 2 children or 3 children or 4. And, one part, not the only part, but one part of what is happening as a society's birth rate declines below desired fertility is that people are wavering and then choosing not to have that extra kid. And presumably not only because of the car seat issue. But so that's sort of where the one more child part of where the title comes from in the essay, right? The idea that, that sort of that particular choice, that particular place is one good place into these questions. And so from that point, I talk about our own experience having one more child at a moment when it seemed sort of difficult, and then there was a pandemic, so it seemed even more difficult once the baby actually arrived. But I think it's, in certain ways, I think there are sort of 2 key breakpoints, right? And one I've written about elsewhere, and Anna's written about sort of more eloquently, which is sort of the breakpoint of like having kids in the place, finding a partner, finding the right relationship, finding the right economic circumstances in your life where you feel ready to start a family. That seems to be one place where society is failing would-be parents. But I think that the sort of one more child place, the place of whether you feel comfortable going from 2 to 3 or 3 to 4, is another place where, in different ways, our society is failing to send the right signals to people who are on the fence. And so, yeah, one thing the essay tries to explore, I guess, is what those right signals may be. and I can continue and tell you what all those signals might be, but I think maybe I've said enough, and we should pivot to conversation.
Well, and we're going to get to some of those things shortly. I will introduce our panelists now. We have a wonderful, vibrant panel tonight. Ross, you've already partially introduced Louie Sussman, whose article, The End of Babies in the New York Times, was also much discussed when it came out. And it hits this topic from I would say, a more humanist or at least non-religious perspective. So it's great to have you with us tonight, Anna. She's a freelance journalist based in New York, currently working on a book entitled, apropos of tonight, Inconceivable Reproduction in an Age of Uncertainty, that looks at the relationship between capitalism and reproduction. She's formerly a reporter at the Wall Street Journal and Reuters. She now contributes to outlets such as The New Yorker, The New York Times, MIT Technology Review, soon we hope Plough. And if you haven't read it yet, you should certainly read that wonderful article, The End of Babies in the New York Times. We're also joined by Sarah C. Williams, who's an author with Plough. Her wonderful book, Perfectly Human, 9 Months with Carrion, is a spiritual autobiography in which she reflects on contemporary debates surrounding identity and personhood and pregnancy. And it would be wonderful to hear a little from you, Sarah. She's trained as a historian at the University of Oxford, where she subsequently taught British and European political and cultural history. And after 17 years at Oxford, in 2005, she moved with her family to Vancouver, where she's taught history at Regent College. And today she lives in the Cotswolds with her husband, Paul, close to the city of Oxford, and she continues to research, write, and teach. She's the author of, the daughter of popular British author Jennifer Rees-Larcombe, and has written a bunch in different publications, not only Plough, also USA Today, Huffington Post, Christianity Today, Commonweal, Oxford Times, and many other outlets. And last but not least, welcome to Plough contributing editor Leah Libresco Sargeant, who has an article in our issue of Plough, as does Sarah, Dependence. She's the author of 2 books, Arriving at Amen and Building the Benedict Option. She runs the Other Feminisms Substack community, focused on interdependence, not autonomy, our co-sponsor for this evening. So it would be great to hear from each of you on the panel your thoughts after reading Ross's article and hearing what he just had to say to us. Leah, why don't you kick things off, and then we'll hear from Anna, and finally from you, Sarah.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure. I'm very in favor of more babies for society at large, as well as for me personally. And I appreciate Ross's look at kind of the broader socio-political implications. But one of the things I really want to drill down on is that one of the reasons we should react seriously to the dearth of babies and our culture's hostility to babies is because babies are, to an extent, a canary in the coal mine. The way we treat babies tells us how our culture thinks about the experience of being dependent on others. And for the most part, our culture has contempt for it and a terrible fear of being in that position. And any culture that is hostile to babies will always be hostile to women. In Rebecca West's travelogue of Yugoslavia between the world wars, called Black Lamb and Gray Falcon, an excellent read, especially if you're stuck in quarantine, she talks about her experience as she's traveling through Croatia of seeing a woman who really just glories in being a mother. And what Dame Rebecca West says is, it might have been different for her if she had been born into a society where men have either lost their desire for children or are prevented from gratifying it by poverty or the fear of war. There she would have been half hated and perhaps more than half for her sex. Her womb would have been a source of danger. And the strange thing is that's very much the world we live in, where women are viewed as, to an extent, dangerous and responsible for diffusing our own danger because we can bear children. And we live in a culture that isn't, for the most part, poor. Ross was right in pointing out it's the richest countries that have seen their birth rates drop the most. But just as increased prosperity has not resulted in increased labor, suddenly we're experiencing what Rebecca West thought was only going to be true of people threatened by poverty. even in the midst of our richness and at every socioeconomic level, there's a sense of precarity that leaves people frightened of babies and more worried about what babies really represent. The fact that it is not true that we belong to ourselves, that we are not autonomous individuals, whether as envisioned by radical libertarians wanting all human relationship made through contract, or the slightly odd and distanced life of Julia back from the Obama era that showed each person alone making all their decisions kind of in isolation, the basic, classical liberal unit of society. In my own piece for Plough on dependence, what I said is that no woman can lightly assent to this illusion of autonomy because a baby is alien to the world of self-ownership. Every woman's citizenship in that imaginary republic is tenuous. A world of autonomous individuals can't acknowledge both woman and child simultaneously. As long as we live in a culture that's hostile to one more child or any child at all, we know, without even having to check, though you can, that we live in a culture that's hostile to women, hostile to the elderly, hostile to the disabled, hostile to anyone who requires things of others for any portion of their life. To really reform this, we want to both look at pro-natalist policy, and I would recommend Matt Brunig's People's Policy Project Family Fun Pack on a few policy interventions we can make to make the life of a parent easier by really spreading the financial risk, at least, among all of us taking responsibility for the next generation. But I think we also see that part of our job is just valuing the experience of dependence, not being shy about admitting our own needs or hiding the times when we rely on others, and kind of continuing to take the temperature of our culture to ask, how hostile is this part of our world? Is this part of our economy to babies? And thus, how hostile is it to everyone who is in need? One article I like returning to as kind of a counterpoint here is actually about Senator Chuck Schumer, who's just, and the headline in the New York Times says, that he's the Yenta of the Senate, always interested in whether his staff are getting married and then interested in whether they're having babies. And it's not just because he's an enormous busybody, though I'm sure that's a part of it. What he tells the reporter is that his biggest regret is not having more children. And he didn't know how much he would regret not having more children until he started having them at all. And employing people in a highly driven culture, he feels a responsibility to be a good boss, to make sure that his employees have the chance to have a family and have the chance to have children. And he views nagging them about it as part of his responsibility. Now, I don't think that's necessarily the best pro-natalist policy to have all, employers play matchmaker. But I think every employer, to be a responsible steward of the labor and the people who've been entrusted to him or her, have to ask, am I creating a culture that allows people to care for others who are vulnerable or space to be vulnerable? I think we see one interesting positive example at Gravity Payments, where Dan Price established a $70,000 minimum wage for his company. And then what he saw after that was not just that people paid down debt or felt more secure or got to take vacations. What happened was that previously they'd have 1 to 2 babies born a year. And in the year following their bumped up minimum wage, 10% of the company got pregnant. There's this pent up desire for children, and not just for children, but to be able to have the space to care for your own parents, to take care of a friend who's sick, to really take some risks for the love of others. And wherever we see those moments where people give a little room to indulge that desire, to love others, to give ourselves, they take it. And I think we all have to, wherever we hold power, try and give others around us a little more space, and to be suspicious. If I run a company, have I kept babies from being born? If I set policy, am I keeping people from caring for their parents? And in my own life, in what I disclose about myself and my own weakness, am I preventing others from acknowledging and asking for help with their own?
Thank you, Leah. Anna?
Thank you, Peter. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. And thank you everyone for inviting me to be part of this discussion. Leah, I couldn't agree more that I think our society is generally pretty hostile to dependence or weakness in any of its forms. And basically, I mean, that's why I've thought about capitalism as being relativist. I feel like there's a huge emphasis on being a productive member of society. I mean, that's a phrase that just rolls off our tongues, and it's something we're used to talking about as an ambition for what we want our children to grow up and be. And that sort of emphasis on productivity, I think, then has real downsides for people who don't fit that description or aren't capable of being productive, such as infants, for example. Ross, so to your, I had some questions specifically about your essay, The Case for Car Seat Deregulation. The first question is, pronatalism, to what end exactly and in what context? Are you thinking about this like on a societal level in the context of the nation state? Because you mentioned pensions and labor force structures. Or are you thinking of this more on the level of individual families or individual people and their personal goals or dreams with respect to what they see as their ideal family size? Because, if you want to boost the pension or get more workers, there's immigration, there's higher taxes, like there are other ways to do that. And maybe you could clarify what counts as a family. Are you making the case for large families within a single household? So 2 straight people who beget more small people and then raise them together? Or with a guy who's parent to 5 kids via 5 different women, is that like a large family of the kind you're arguing for? Because I think that we do see that happening in the data, people having 3 or 4 or 5 kids, and these are typically people with the least resources. And I don't see a lot of support, either rhetorical support or material support from conservatives for the caregivers who are in this situation. And then what about single and queer people, what some call socially infertile people who would like to have families? And what about medically infertile people? Because I believe your faith tradition, is against the use of assisted reproductive technologies. So how does this pronatalism account for people who simply do not have, good luck? They don't meet the right person. Their person doesn't have the gametes that enable reproduction to happen, or they have a medical issue. Is this pronatalism for everyone or just for some people? And also, conservatives tend to see the family as an institution through which care and resource provision is privatized. So I'm wondering, in this pronatal vision, do you see the state as then playing a larger role in supporting families in order to make it easier for them to have more children? And if so, does that then extend to single people or individuals without children? Because again, with this factor of luck or, because of circumstances, a lot of people aren't part of a family unit, or they don't benefit from the material and emotional support that we associate with family. So who are we supporting in this vision? And if we talk about pronatalism in this context of generating more people, how does one account for the asymmetrical risk and burden, both health-wise and time-wise, that this places on women? Katha Pollitt, who's a writer for The Nation, had a column recently where she said, "Women are the social safety net." This is something we've seen during COVID. So as Peter mentioned, I'm researching a book. And luckily, I'm so behind on it that I don't have to plug it or tell you how to pre-order it on Amazon. And in fact, I'm so behind that if you're watching and you're interested in this topic and you want to be interviewed for the book, please feel free to reach out. But the book focuses on not like should you or shouldn't you have more kids, but can you or can't you, and why or why not? So in my reporting, I've spoken to single people who struggle to find the right person and who don't feel equipped to be a single parent in this society. I've spoken to queer couples who are hindered by the cost of fertility treatments. I spoke recently to a working class gay man who feels that he and his husband won't be able to become parents because even adoption is prohibitively expensive for them, let alone surrogacy and donor eggs and all that entails. And to me, these are just they're just heartbreaking stories of individuals and couples who want to have a family, this thing that we've sort of built up and mythologized in our society. And they feel, for a variety of reasons, whether it's just like the brute force of economics, or in some cases, perceived obstacles, or just their own preferences about the kind of family they envision that's not materializing, that this is out of reach for them. So I think that raises the question, like, why does it feel hard to make this decision? If it's not necessarily a matter of car seats, if you're still at, 0, or, going from 0 to 1 or 1 to 2, why do the stakes feel so high? And my observation so far is it has a lot to do with a combination of people's expectations of what a good life is, both for themselves and for what they envision for their children, alongside a perception or a feeling, which is, to be clear, is not just something people feel, but is actually borne out by the data. I just don't think that most people follow this data very carefully. But, people perceive declining social mobility, a shrinking middle class, a rising cost of living. And they have this awareness or belief that, like, in order for their kids to have a strong foundation, they're going to also have to put in a lot of time and resources to give their kid a good start in life. So rather than being something that just happens, obviously because of family planning, it really becomes a choice, and a very high stakes choice. Like, it's this big endeavor, this big undertaking, rather than just like welcoming a small person into the household, who theoretically shouldn't even take up that much space, right? It's like a very small person, at least when they start. So, I think this question of like, what kind of future awaits my child? And this is completely without talking yet about climate concerns, which is a whole nother question. I think this is really worrying for people, especially compared with maybe a generation or two ago. As a last thought, I want to point people to another essay in this issue of the magazine about what single people need from the church. But I don't have a faith practice, but I found a lot of it really resonant, where the writer talks about how intentional she has to be to create bonds with other people in the absence of a family. She doesn't have a family that she lives with, or she's a single person. And so I think this question of like, how can we create family-like relationships, interdependence, is, I think, a perfect word for it, more available to people who don't have those family relationships, by virtue of luck or circumstance. And I also think there's an interesting question about language, and related to how we mythologize family and I kind of idealize it. Like, I'm an only child, but I refer to my closest friends as being like a sister or like a brother, which is obviously strange because as an only child, like, how the heck would I know what it's like to have a brother or sister? But that's just, language that comes to mind to indicate a real intimacy. So I wonder again, like, how do we not just help people have kids or more kids, but just help them feel more connected and in close and caring relationships more broadly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. And we'll give Ross a chance to respond to your question, pronatalism for whom, in just a moment. And for your other comments and suggestions as well. Before we dive into that discussion, though, Sarah, would you have some thoughts to add, just to kind of set the stage and get us going?
Well, thank you. Let me add my thanks. Ross, thank you for your article, which has raised this really important question that we have to think about as a society. And thanks to Plough for creating a space, both in the journal and in our discussion tonight, where we can bring that question to the forefront and discuss it from our various positions. Your article, Ross, brings this kind of existential conundrum into the foreground. And it's extremely baffling. With a fertility rate below replacement, our society will die. And we are remarkably unperturbed by that. An article in the BBC noted that the UK's declining fertility rate is ahead of projections. And I quote from a headline this last July: "The world is ill prepared for the global crash in children being born, which is set to have a jaw-dropping impact on societies." But I don't really see that many jaws dropping right now, just as you suggest in your article, Ross. We have to explain why we actually, in terms of our practices, seem to care so little about this issue. That's the real conundrum here. And at a fundamental sort of level, Ross, where you come to in your article is really to argue that underneath all of it is selfishness. And I agree with you, but of course, in one sense, all societies are selfish, all societies. And I just want to press in to put some more language around your use of the word selfish, a kind of to broaden the repertoire of language, because our peculiar postmodern selfishness, if we can call it that, our unique selfishness, if we could call it that, I think is linked to our perception of time. And really, this is just the one comment I want to make, to talk about the way we imagine the future itself, how we actually understand time. Our postmodern selfishness, of which the choice not to have one more child is merely one symptom, is, I think, bound up with this pervasive and endemic presentism, an incapacity, in a sense, to imagine anything which extends beyond the now. And debt wasn't actually something you talked about in your article, Ross, but I do think there's a really direct connection here. Certainly there's a chronological correlation between the propensity of Western societies to base financial systems on debt and our failure, as it were, to invest in the future at a most fundamental level by replacing ourselves in terms of the number of people in our societies. And so we're sort of stripping the future, as it were, of its resources in order to consume the benefits of an imagined or projected future right now. And yet at the same time, we're not reinvesting to replenish that future. And both those things, I think, debt and our attitude towards children reveal, they're part of the same dynamic that reveals now as our only singular reference point. And there's lots of ways that we could think about that in relation to time and secularization, for example. But the people I studied, the Victorians, the people I spent my life with, they planted gardens knowing that the garden would be at its most beautiful and at the height of its design when their grandchildren were adults. They were designing and creating 150 years out. And so the unit with which they imagined and created and produced, even the sewers under the City of London are still going strong 180 years on, and they're set to be pretty good for another 180 years. They were producing within a different kind of unit of time, even though their life expectancy, of course, was so much shorter than our own. And so there's something, I think, fundamental about the way that we imagine time itself, which is correlated and integrally related to the questions that we're talking about here. And I wonder, at least maybe throwing into the mix time and temporality as a way of talking about and helping us add language, both to the concept of selfishness, but also as a way of auditing and thinking and imagining our practices on a day-to-day basis. In what ways are our practices pressing back and resisting the pressure towards shrinking time into the now? And of course, when we talk about ordinary everyday practices, it really comes down to what we're actually teaching the children that we have around our table today. How are we teaching waiting, patience, the rarest of all character qualities in our culture? How do we begin to foster what it might be to long and yearn and wait for something that we don't get to have in the present. And so I want to sort of inject time as one of the dimensions in which we might want to think about some of the questions that you're talking about here.
Well, thank you to the three of you, and that gives us plenty of grace for a great discussion. Let's take around 20 minutes. So we've heard about the dimension of time. We've heard about for whom, what does it mean for there to be a large family, and how to build kinship networks that go beyond just the immediate nuclear family. We've heard about Senator Chuck Schumer and his Yenta ways. So Ross, which of these threads would you like to tug on first?
I mean, that's an awful lot. And at least I feel good about not saying too much on my own at the beginning. First, starting with time, I feel that I should mention that Sarah, I believe you're coming to us from like 1 a.m. English, Greenwich Mean Time, right? Is that so? I just want to, put that out there so that everybody appreciates that, that extremely eloquent, much more profound than anything I could say, meditation was delivered from someone who is, deeply sleep deprived and incredibly kind to give her time to be with us. I guess let me try and go backwards a little bit from Sarah through Anna towards Leah. I think the question of time is really interesting, in part because there's this strange dynamic that's not just a dynamic around fertility, but I do think plays some slightly mysterious role, where we simultaneously live in a society that has, as Anna suggested, this kind of capitalist culture that places this incredible premium on sort of, this sense of productivity and achievement, and potentially invulnerability. And then at the same time, we have hanging over us this sense that all of our achievements are pointless because climate change is going to destroy our civilization in about 50 years. Now, obviously, the first idea is maybe more associated with the right, and the second idea is more associated with the left in some sense. But I think they actually quite converge in certain ways, in certain kinds of like respectable centrist opinion, where you have people sort of simultaneously holding the ideas, these two sort of contradictory seeming ideas about how to use our time, that, the sort of the pointlessness of the long term, but then the incredibly pressing demands to be productive in the short term. And somehow I do think that those both work together against the kind of commitments that you make when you have a child, because having a child is sacrificing some of your productivity, sacrificing some of your immediate time for the sake of a deeper time that, climate change and other apocalyptic threats make us feel that we don't have. So that's one response to some of these thoughts. To Anna's questions, which are really, really good questions. And I think the question in general of what does pronatalism mean, if it can mean something for the political left, cultural and social liberals, is a really important one, because I think, one reason why, to Sarah's point, there isn't this sort of sense of shock among a lot of people at, the stark birth dearth in rich societies, is that concern about issues like this is coded as patriarchal, traditionalist, and reactionary. And obviously, for a reason, because the people most concerned about it tend to be conservatives of various stripes, which I am. So I think for that reason, some of the questions that you raise on are actually sort of really important questions that are sort of internal to left-wing dialogue and conversation, and may become sort of more urgent and interesting as the sort of lived consequences of an aging, low fertility society play themselves out. And you can see sort of different dynamics in your essay, or sort of center left, Matt Iglesias's book 1 Billion Americans, sort of pro-natalist in a very different kind of way from this conversation overall. But they're sort of the beginnings of an interesting conversation. For my part, I'll just say that, part of my views on some of these questions has changed in the sense that just at the level of policy, without getting into sort of the personal, I think as a conservative, I do think that there are better environments for children to be raised in. And I think that, there is a sense in which the gift of being in, an intimate relationship with your biological mother and father is a unique thing that is worth sort of a certain kind of privileging, to use the language of the left, from society. And I think if you go back 20 or 30 years to, what social conservatism was sort of doing and talking about, there was a strong sense that after the sexual revolution, you had this breakdown in the two-parent family, breakdown in marriage, this stark rise in out-of-wedlock births, and a sort of rise after a decline in teen births. And the focus of social conservatism was on sort of protecting the two-parent family, propping it up, figuring out how to dissuade people from, having kids outside that context and encourage people to have kids within that context. That was sort of, part of the backdrop of like welfare reform, right, in the 1990s, was sort of founded on this sense that like we don't want the government sort of subsidizing single parenthood, and we're effectively discouraging marriage with various policies. To me, the landscape is pretty different now. And my view is that to some extent, cultural conservatives sort of face a partial choice between a world where you have more babies born in family contexts that I still consider distinctly non-ideal. Certainly the people having, 4 kids with 4 different partners is an extremely non-ideal situation for all kinds of reasons. But if the choice is between that world and a world of sterility, pornography, and, a birth rate that drops from 2 to 1, I will take the world of, sort of disrupted and non-ideal family arrangements. I think it's a more human and better world than the world of sort of control and sterility and just steep population decline. And that affects my policy views, right? How you design pronatalist policy, you can have a pronatalist policy that's a universal family benefit, or you can have a pronatalist policy that tries to link itself to work and stable families and so on. And I was more in favor of the second kind 10 years ago, and now I'm more in favor of a universal benefit. And in the sense that, like, better babies in non-ideal circumstances than no babies at all. I'm not sure how many social conservatives would take that deal, but it's certainly something that's in my mind in these issues, with the one caveat that I think there is a sense in which, some forms of assisted reproduction, setting aside sort of particular Catholic perspectives on this, encourage the kind of commodification of children, basically, that, where you're treating children as effectively something to be acquired and purchased in ways that reinforce, I think, some of the capitalist dynamics that you're concerned about, Anna, and also reinforce some of the trends that and tendencies that Leah is talking about, where, children are valued in a sense, but they're valued as objects and commodities and things to be sort of acquired as rather than, ultimately, once you have them, they become an end unto themselves, but it creates a sort of dynamic where, before they're humanized, they're dehumanized. And I can't really help but think that is a step away from ultimately the kind of society that welcomes the largest number of human beings on their own terms. And I'll sort of wrap up there, but just say, something we haven't gotten into in my piece is sort of talking. One thing I say near the end, and I think, I guess Sarah's point about selfishness is sort of what I was talking about. But, the idea of children as a means to sort of, in religious terms, their parents' sanctification, in non-religious terms, just sort of, being a self-sacrificial human being. That I have a friend who has 5 kids, who's a Jewish liberal, not a trad in any way, shape, or form. And he wrote me after the piece, and he said, you're putting on kenosis, this idea of like self-emptying and self-sacrifice, and that's fine. But aren't you leaning a little bit too too hard on that in the argument. And I'm sorry, I'm just looking up what he said to me. And he said something like, and also never mind kenosis, how about just fun and the deep joy of having that many people who know you that well and will be with you forever, or having loud, crowded Thanksgivings. And I think, there's wisdom there too, right? That like we sort of moving back and forth between policy and moral formation and so on. But there is a basic sense in which, human beings are good, and it's probably a bad sign that our Thanksgiving dinners aren't that crowded. Well, especially this year, but that's a separate issue.
I think this touches on the point of, are people selfish, or do people have a thwarted hunger, right? Like, it's not just Tyler Cowen, the economist, who says there are selfish reasons to have more kids. It's not just your friend. People, for the most part, like children. And that question of how much is high investment parenting discouraging people from having kids because they feel like they don't have permission to want it until they're ready. They don't even have permission to be married until everything in their life is squared away. Ross, you talked about the question of, is it better to have more children in tougher circumstances rather than sterility? I think one great ethnography on this subject is Promises I Can Keep by Catherine Eden and Marie Kevelos, which is about poorer mothers who have children before marriage, because marriage just doesn't seem like it's necessarily ever going to be on the table for them. And they refuse to live a life without children. And a lot of what they say attracts them to having children isn't kenosis, though that comes with it, as you're right to point out. It's that they want to love someone unconditionally and be loved back in the way a child loves you. And that hunger is absolutely correct. I'd say the real thing I want to move forward with as part of what a pronatalist society requires is both significant social support for parents and for anyone caring for someone who needs care, and a reawakening of that hunger. There is a piece that really brought home to me how much I don't even picture how much I'm missing some of the time, by Andrew Youngert in the Front Porch Republic, called The Family Tree Stripped, where he's just talking about what we lose when we lose children, because that absence, as Sarah pointed out, why aren't people in the streets, for the children they don't have that they want? That absence is harder to feel. And he says, when average family size falls from 4 to 3, each person loses a sibling, but he or she also loses 4 aunts and uncles and 12 cousins. The collapse to one child wipes out the siblings, but it also wipes out the aunts, uncles, and cousins. And when I think about what's awakened my imagination for what a large family looks like, I think of Louisa May Alcott's 8 Cousins and Rose and Bloom books. But this sense of how large a family can be, both in terms of your blood relations and everyone else who takes an interest, is much larger than what I see most of my friends having grown up with. And even for, my trattier, more wild, having children right out of college friends, what people have had is larger than what we're daringly aspiring to. I think one other great group that's really been pushing on this is that there are Black women who are really pushing on what we mean by reproductive justice, and why it always seems to mean access to contraceptives and abortions, especially in poorer communities, and that there are Black women leaders saying, where is the reproductive justice that's about our right to have children and to have the support we need to have children? Why is it that when people come in to help us, the only thing they're bringing are IUDs?
Yeah, I think you see that in policy. There's a great line in Laura Briggs's book, I think it's called All Politics or Reproductive Politics, where she says that the logic that supplies mandated covered contraception to Black women on Medicaid, while corporate insurance, if you're a high earning white woman working at a tech company, you get egg freezing, you get fertility coverage. She calls that logic precisely eugenic. And I think that's a very powerful phrase. But speaking of assisted reproductive technologies, Ross, when you talked about children as commodities, were you saying that because in the U.S. there's a transaction required in order to have one? Like, we have a privatized healthcare system, and so you're kind of buying a baby, and you can buy all these services like surrogacy or donor eggs or anything, or because or the things that are sort of internal to that process, like pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, or sort of designer babies, as you might call them? Or are you I mean, because there's countries where like that stuff is part of healthcare. It's just healthcare. It's not it's not a transaction per se. It's not necessarily part of a capitalist system.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm sort of lumping a lot of different kinds of things together. I think that you can imagine a world where certain things are decommodified in sort of assisted reproduction terms, just by sort of being supplied by the welfare state. That's true. I think that I don't know. I think surrogacy raises a lot of sort of moral questions that were wrestled with maybe more seriously in the 1980s, when it was sort of just starting out, than today. My feeling is that that's sort of an area where feminism has kind of sort of accepted the logic of capitalism in certain ways. Whereas, if you go back to like debates about the Baby M case and stuff in the 80s, you had real divides within feminism about like, the rights of the surrogate and what. Anyway, but that's sort of, I don't want to take us off on too many tangents. I mean, I think ultimately some of these questions do end up centering around, when you think human life begins, right? So there's questions about embryos and so on that are sort of bound up in debates around abortion, where questions of commodification only come up if you accept certain moral premises about what the embryo actually is. But I mean, in general, the United States has sort of leaned very hard into a kind of freewheeling economy of reproduction, and what in other countries you get, as you say, sometimes assisted reproduction is more paid for, but there's also often more restrictions on, like, in European countries, there's not all, but there are more restrictions on what can be done with embryos and so on. So there's a sort of, I think, America has ended up, as always, we lean very heavily into personal liberty, but in personal liberty of moneyed adults, especially.
I think also one thing I'd say about the idea of a right to have a child as opposed to a right to support for children and for families is just that all the government support in the world can't guarantee you a child. And this comes back a little to Ross's point about kenosis, that being open to being a parent, being open to care for someone who's vulnerable, brings with it what happens when your care isn't enough. My family, we've had a baby who's just celebrated her first birthday this week, but Beatrice is the 7th child we've had and the first to make it to birth. And throughout that, there was never any guarantee, no matter what doctor we talked to, and no matter when we looked at the process of adoption, which is really opening a different process that's ultimately totally out of your control, that we would have a child no matter how much we wanted one. And so one reason I have a reluctance to talk about this in terms of a right to a child is just that that's not a promise anyone can make you. As a parent, when you accept a child, you accept them as a person, which means accepting the fact that they will die one day and that everything about their life is also out of your control, that we can't purchase the child we want or genetically select the child we want. That we just do our best for the people entrusted to us. And that's the most anyone can do as parents. And so, Ross, when you talk about where does kenosis come into it, it comes into it the same way it does for all our, biggest relationships. When we love someone else who is a distinct person from ourselves, we put ourselves at the mercy of their life, its ups and downs. And being a parent is just such a specific relationship. And someone is so helpless that even I'm a big wuss about any amount of not going to my baby when she cries at night. But that parenthood can't be our only relationship of that type. And the whole discussion of rights language kind of pushes us away from the fundamental vulnerability that comes with relationship, rather than an entitlement to some experience we're selecting or ultimately control.
Thank you, Leah. And we're about to go to audience Q&A, but and while those responses are being collected, there's one thing I want to just throw at you, our panel, and at you, Ross. We'll just take a couple more minutes while those while the various audience questions are being assembled here. I mean, one big reason I'll just say for myself, when we were deciding to put together this issue on family, and Ross pitched the idea on what the case for one more child, I kind of jumped at it. I come from a family of 8 siblings. My mom had me in the 3rd year of medical school and practiced medicine through having 8 kids. We had that kind of loud Thanksgiving, messy household situation growing up. And I realized that's something that not everyone can have. But looking at it, it happened in the context of a particularly supportive church community. And it highlights to me something that I want to dive into just a little more. Can't both things be true, that you need a place where a woman can be a doctor and have 8 children if she would so like, and be supported through it, while also supporting that culturally, and with, I think, a faith tradition that makes it possible to see that the pain and difficulty of bringing up 8 kids has a wider purpose, maybe even an eternal purpose that goes beyond whatever satisfaction I may get from my often unsatisfactory offspring. So I would just like to hear you. Why is there a trade-off? And wouldn't it be possible to think in more radical terms about what type of society would make it possible for there to be big families, even if you're not a multimillionaire?
I mean, a society where men did dishes and cleaned up around the house would be a good start, I think. Like, there's a lot of research on time use, that looks at time use surveys and finds direct correlations. I was just reading one that looked at like 5 East Asian countries, and the more housework that men do, the higher the fertility preferences are for women. So that's one thing that would really help.
I mean, I think there's a real challenge here, right? Which I think, those of us who are culturally conservative in some sense need to acknowledge, right? Which is that, there are, so take, to Anna's point, right? So take Amy Coney Barrett, right? So, this is a figure who, to a lot of social conservatives, seems like an embodiment of what you're just describing, Peter, right? Like this world where you can have sort of, the best of what feminism has reasonably asked for women, and also the widest possible range, the widest possibility for, motherhood, family formation, and everything else. But it is, it's really hard, right? Like this is, so Amy Coney Barrett has a husband who I would assume does a lot of dishes, right? And like that sort of is, so step one is to have a fusion of cultural conservatism and feminism. You need this sort of, a model of marriage that is more companionate and more gender egalitarian in certain ways than traditional marriages often were. At the same time, like the traditionalist insight, which is correct, is that, because men and women are so different in what is involved biologically in having kids, you need a role for the man that is sort of distinctive in certain ways, right? Like there really is this profound difference between the way the bond between children and parents is forged for women and how it's forged for men. And my wife, I was just promoting it on Twitter. My wife has a book about sort of the science of the maternal instinct that's coming out later this year. And, there's lots of things to take away from that book. But, one thing is just sort of this extent to which there is sort of a deep unchosenness to the experience of parenting for women.
I do.
Different. and therefore you need anyway, I'm sort of but you need a sort of male role that bonds the man. Historically, that male role was this sort of providing role, but then you need to balance that with this need for this sort of more companionate marriage where the husband is more involved in the home. That's like, you're trying to sort of mix a bunch of different cultural models together, and then you have just the reality, and this is sort of circles back to the original idea for my essay, I suppose, where in a world of freedom, which, for all the constraints of capitalism and climate change, we inhabit a world of radical freedom relative to our ancestors. Most people are not going to choose to have 8 or 9 or 10 kids. Most people are going to be sort of in a zone of, are you having 2 versus 1, 3 versus 2, and so on, to say nothing of the initial dilemmas of having kids at all. And so you need models that fit you need models that make it possible to have more career women who can enable more women to have careers and 8 children, but you need those models to also be flexible and adaptable to, the couple with 2 kids just contemplating a third. Anyway, I'm rambling, but I'm just trying to get at sort of the, we're trying to think about the good society here, and you have a lot of different patterns, new patterns and old patterns that I do think there are syntheses here that would work, but they take effort to get to.
And I don't want to cast any aspersions on Amy Coney Barrett's husband's dishwashing, but I do want to just do a little fact check that family doesn't sustain itself on their own. The Barretts had a female relative who did a lot to help the whole family, just like Elizabeth Warren did, which made it possible for her to both raise children and pursue her career, just like the Obamas did. That a lot of the time when we see the most successful models of people blending parenthood and career, they're really not depending on the nuclear family alone. And when it comes to striking that balance, I think it's important to remember that the kind of, aggressive, do what you love work pattern isn't true for everyone. That when we talk about being ambitious outside of just the family, that ambition and desire to do good in the world doesn't have to be channeled purely through a job. That for many people, jobs are not sources of fulfillment. They're sources of, the money it takes to have the parts of your life that are fulfilling. And the more room we can make for people, to genuinely be involved as volunteers in their community, to take on part-time work, to spend time, with their married parts of their family, with their kids, I think the more room there is for meaning for men and women that, again, shouldn't be limited to a job, because most jobs are not where people feel at the end of the day they've done the most to care for the world.
Let's jump to the audience questions. I think we touched on a lot of great issues there. I'll combine 2 questions because they seem somewhat similar. One is from one reader: this issue does not apply to many African nations and those of the Muslim faith. Thoughts on that? And another observes, how much of this is primarily an issue for relatively affluent whites? The lack of children doesn't seem to be a problem for most non-white communities and societies.
So that's not, so the first point, it's correct that Africa is the great exception to all of these trends. African fertility rates have not converged as expected with the rest of the world to date, which is why the future of humanity basically is guaranteed to be heavily African, no matter what. It's less true of the Muslim world. Basically, almost everywhere outside Africa, you have this convergence where societies, whereas in Europe and the United States, societies went through this demographic transition to below replacement birth rates after they achieved a certain level of wealth. In a lot of developing countries, the transition is happening sooner and faster. And so you have dynamics like, in China, where China is going to grow old effectively before it has grown as rich as its East Asian neighbors. And this is also a reason why you can't just, if, again, on the sort of technical policy side of this, you can't just say, well, we'll rely on immigration. There will always be more immigrants to fill Western labor forces. Like, Latin America's birth rates are converging with the United States. Like that assumption held in 1985. It doesn't hold anymore. And domestically, it's also not that there are sort of, vast differences. There are higher birth rates for recent immigrant communities from Latin America than whites. But, in fact, the big plunge in fertility after the Great Recession was a plunge in Hispanic fertility in the US after the housing bubble burst. And you had, I think, a lot of wealth wiped out for recent immigrant families. You had a Hispanic baby bust. So there is something, it's not just white people, it's not just Europeans and North Americans, it's not just fully developed countries. In general, this is a sort of modernity-wide phenomenon, with Africa as a big exception. Israel is a small and interesting exception, some other exceptions, but the trend exists well beyond just the upper middle class white people.
I would add also that it's not clear how much of the high birth rates in some of the African countries is due to an unmet need for contraception. It's around like 200 million women, I think, according to Guttmacher, or something in that ballpark, say they want, that's their estimate for how many women would like to have contraceptive access but don't.
Thank you. I'll jump to the next question. I'll again combine two. Can someone explain how we can be pro-baby, pro-natalist, while also recognizing women are learning more about pregnancy, childbirth, and when they do, choose to opt out altogether? And somewhat related, another question. I would love for the panelists to address the toll of pregnancy on women's physical, mental, and emotional health. Childbearing doesn't start when there's a baby in your arms who needs to be put into a car seat.
Well, I'll take a swing at that for
Definitely
a second.
True.
Yeah. Again, I think this is where we see that babies and women are, the real breaking point of what's already a problem in our culture. Pregnancy absolutely takes a toll on your body. I had a relatively easy pregnancy, luckily me, but I still, fell asleep in the middle of the afternoon. And I've had friends who had severe nausea that was debilitating and made it hard to hold work. And just like is the case for every single chronic illness, we don't live in a culture that's friendly to people who are going through a time of physical debility. So, to that extent, when people learn more about pregnancy, do they want out? Very plausibly. Now, you might be able to avoid pregnancy, but you can't assume you'll avoid chronic illness or any kind of enfeeblement. So we have to push for a much more robust safety net and a much more just way of treating Social Security and disability insurance, I'll just say as a hobby horse, so that you don't have to liquidate all your assets to be deserving of help. So that's kind of a question of justice for everyone. Now, I just do want to push back against the questioner who said that as people learn more about pregnancy and children, they decide to have fewer children. First of all, there is a real gap between how many children American women say they want to have and how many they do have. But I also just don't know that we can say that people are genuinely learning more about pregnancy. A health class diagram is not the same as learning about a child. And the little robots we had that you stick slots in are not a baby. I don't know about other people's health classes. We had robots that cried and you put little cards in their back to calm them down. And the real thing is much nicer. The less you have younger siblings to kind of experience directly, the more all your friends are putting off childbearing, the harder it is to know what having a baby is actually like. And for me, it was a huge moment when one of my friends left me in charge of her 2-year-old for a weekend while she and her husband went to a B&B. And I discovered I could take care of a baby, at least for a weekend. And a baby went from being purely theoretical to being a real lived reality that I could grapple with, struggle with, and enjoy. I knew a lot more about babies then than I did from babies in a book or babies as a threat. And the fewer and fewer babies people see, the more and more distant they are from the lived reality of parents. I'd say the less they know about pregnancy and about children.
Sarah, do you have any thoughts on this? I think you're muted, Sarah.
Yeah.
Sorry. I said I need to think of my dear Victorians again, because there's been some really interesting studies of the 1840s by a number of social historians who've argued that this very fascinating transition takes place in the Victorian period from the perception of motherhood as a matter of childbearing to motherhood as a matter of child rearing. And that changes, for example, the naming of children. to more idiosyncratic names, which heighten the personal characters of individual children, but it also makes room for the use of pain relief in childbearing, which was, of course, a rather important innovation of 1848 in chloroform and so on in Queen Victoria. And it also stretches out the extreme emotional pain of having children to a lifetime of having them. So motherhood becomes this excruciatingly prolonged activity, which requires different kinds of resources of a woman, including her increased education. So I think we might be going back into a culture which is almost more fascinated by childbearing again than it is by child rearing. And the physical pain, I had very difficult pregnancies, horrific ones, and not as many as I had hoped as a result. But the acute emotional pain of raising children that don't turn out at all as we expected, perhaps particularly during their adolescent years, is something we also don't talk about in terms of the mental health of mothers. And so I'm just, throwing that out, that what actually constitutes motherhood is something that is culturally bound, but it also has enormous implications on what we expect of mothers, and perhaps therefore how they respond to the experience of having children for the long haul.
Thank you. We'll move to the next question. Let me just find it. There's a question here, and this is picking up maybe on something that you were saying, Leah. I wonder if the attitude of hostility to babies equals hostility to women also has a hostile toward the elderly aspect. Or is hostility even the right word?
I think hostility is the right word. I think the more that we ask people to kind of keep whatever is physically difficult about them or emotionally difficult private, the more we're definitely creating a culture that's hostile to elderly, hostile to women, hostile to babies. I remember once I was back when I could take trains places and there wasn't a pandemic. I was in line for Amtrak and there was a very fussy baby nearby. And the young man in a polo shirt near me expressed frustration the baby was around at all, as a noisy person disruptive to the otherwise beautiful atmosphere of the train station. And I bit my tongue for a second. I said, I think that's really the price we pay for young parents ever moving around in public. Is that if they do that, they're going to bring their babies, and then their babies are going to be noisy. I didn't even add or vomit on you, though that's true. And to his credit, he said, I guess that's true. But I think we just don't think often enough what's the price of allowing people to be part of our society. And for babies, it means screaming and diaper blowouts. For the elderly, sometimes, are you excited about those things? For the elderly, it sometimes means the same, that there's a real loss of bodily control that's very frightening or upsetting, that there's, sometimes that parents, see someone in a wheelchair and go oh, well, you mustn't look at them and you mustn't acknowledge the wheelchair because it's so humiliating and embarrassing to be disabled that the most polite thing is to try and pretend they're not there. And in each of those cases, we're saying that anyone who isn't kind of a perfect physical specimen is in some way causing problems by being in public, or that we're all doing them a favor by ignoring the reality of who they are, which includes whatever is physically difficult. And that we have to be comfortable with us in our full bodily frailty, because that is who we are. And everyone will suffer in this way at some point in their lives. So you might as well practice kindness now and model it so that people are kind to you.
I think it's important. Also, I agree with everything Leah just said. I do think it's important to stress that there's not a paradox exactly here, but sort of a feature of our society is that there are ways in which we treat both children and the elderly better than societies in the past, right? That, childhood is, for better or worse, in some cases, safer than ever before. People who are mentally ill are, not always, but are often treated better than they would have been in the past. there was societies in the past, in certain ways, were more willing to let people exist, but once they existed, would treat them worse than we do. And we seem to be we've sort of brought people up to a higher standard, but when it seems like we can't meet that standard, then a sort of ruthless cruelty comes in, and you get euthanasia, or you get just people not existing at all. Anyway, I'm not fully forming this, but there is we have gained things clearly in terms of our treatment of the elderly, the sick. People weren't in sort of a proper Victorian environment, in proper Victorian upper class environment. People were not letting their babies have blowout diapers. They were just handing them off to a nurse. So there is progress, but then there's also a sort of a shadow side of the progress too.
The residual hostility that Leah was talking about, because you're right, there absolutely has been progress in attitudes, and the disability rights movement has obviously been responsible for changes in attitudes and our understandings. But I remember once actually talking to a disability law professor, and she had this point that some of that animosity comes from the sense of vulnerability, that we are all kind of not yet disabled, whether it's becoming older and having the infirmities that come with old age, or, getting knocked over by a car and losing the use of limbs or something like that. It's a real possibility. And I think that knowledge, that it's not necessarily always conscious knowledge, but that is something that might be at the heart of that hostility, versus if you think of something like racial animosity, the chances of me becoming a Black man, with all the vulnerabilities that entails, are very low. Sort of Rachel Dolezal kind of weird things like that aside, but I do know somehow that there's a chance that at any moment I could become infirm in some way, or sick. What I think is interesting about children is we were all children. People forget, I don't know, when they turn 18, when they go to college, or when they become 12. I mean, I know I watch my friends grow up, and there's a moment where if you call your friend's baby a baby, it's so offensive. I don't know if they're 3, they're I'm not a baby, I'm a kid. They get, and then I'm sure it goes, along in the years. But, that sense of distance from children is strange, because there's one thing, and to women, as you said, as well, as if we didn't all, we weren't all born of women, etc.
And I think you're absolutely right that people are frightened because they know this can happen to them. And I think we just need Olympia Dukakis from Moonstruck to come around, striking everyone upside the head and reminding them, no matter what you do, you're going to die, just like everybody else. That the more we try and deny that fact, and deny that we'll be vulnerable at various points before that, the more hateful we get, because we're running from the truth about ourselves and despising it in others. Sarah, I loved your memoir so much, and I kept swinging between kind of, being so moved by the tenderness in your family and just wanting to punch your doctors in the face, who seemed to be completely unaware that they had ever been babies or had ever been vulnerable in any way. And I don't know what it is, because I've had this experience myself, that for many doctors who are constantly in control, they seem so hostile to anyone who actually does need care.
I think we're bringing out something quite an important layer here in what Anna's saying, what you followed up with to do with fear. It's counterintuitive to us to understand society in relation to fear. It's something that we often don't talk about, but really getting to the bottom of what a culture is truly afraid of gives us enormous insight into how that culture behaves, even particularly the unspoken fears. And there is a profound fear of physical vulnerability in our culture. There's an immense fear of what we might call abnormality, suboptimality. There's a tremendous fear of death, because most of us haven't actually experienced anybody having a good death. And being with somebody who's dying well is an incredibly beautiful human experience, but very few people actually have the privilege of that, of looking over, as it were, into life beyond. And so that kind of shrouding in our culture plays into all of these obsessional and irrational fears, really. And I suppose one of the things I hope for our culture in a year of COVID, which doesn't have very many silver linings, is that somehow we might find language for talking a little bit better about death. We just had 1,800 people die yesterday, another 1,300 today. And then the tone of our public life is changing, and we're beginning to find language, finally, to talk about death. And I find that rather beautiful and really quite hopeful.
So we've reaching the end of our time together, and this is actually a beautiful note to end on. Thank you all. Anna, was there something you wanted to add? I noticed you.
I just wanted to say that the Julia, the life of Julia thing that Leah critiqued, I mean, to me, that there's something about the government being there for its citizens that I can see how it can be taken as this like sad, lonely individual person relying on the state for everything. But I also think it's not the worst thing in the world to have you're arguing for a safety net, and that was just one depiction. I mean, that's Julia moving along in a cartoon. But we don't see the rest of her full, rich, interdependent life. We just see the part where she's getting certain government services. So, I know that a lot of people hate Life of Julia, but I think it's interesting, model. And it kind of reminds me of life of like the people I know in Denmark and life of people in Norway, where there's the sense of security and safety that I can say I don't feel here at all in the US.
Well, to an extent, Anna, I think it undersells what the government does, because the government doesn't take care of you as like a series of pop-ups on the side of what service it's providing. There's always a person associated with those services. And often when we're debating policy, we don't talk enough about the social workers or other people who are on the front lines, as the human face of a policy. And similarly, Sarah, what you're talking about there, as we talk about preparing for death, we don't talk enough about the concreteness of it. That when you're being screened for, disability insurance, there's a person there screening you at some point, a person there who has a certain amount of discretion, but who's also the face of the policy to you. And that each of us, as we kind of talk about how we plan, don't talk as much in terms of whose hands will be the last to touch me, who will dress me in these clothes, who will wash me, what will be people's last glimpse of me as they prepare me for burial. And I think the more concrete we get when we talk about the human connections at each of these steps, whether they're provided as part of a safety net or whether they're provided, in family, or provided, by an order of nuns who care for the dying. And if you think you may have a vocation in that direction, contact the Hawthorne Dominican sisters. That in each of those cases, these aren't abstractions, and we can't talk about them as abstractions. They're conducted person to person, and the more we put that truth in front of us, the better prepared we are for those needs.
I feel like we need death Instagram influencers then, to like the way we've had mommy bloggers and these like hip moms on Instagram. Then maybe you need someone modeling it. I'm obviously joking.
Oh, but I hate Instagram, Anna. It's so overproduced. People don't need that. They need to go wash their neighbor's body in their house, and go take care of them in that way. You need to like touch the dead body yourself rather than see the photo of someone else doing it.
Well, I think
Thank you, Peter, for having us for this discussion.
Yeah, no, this is great. And it really does, what we're talking about is actually circles back to how Ross concludes his article. It's this question of interdependence, of allowing ourselves to depend on others, which comes with self-emptying, the kenosis that you write about so eloquently at the end of your article there, Ross. As we conclude our evening, we should, would you have any kind of final summary comments?
I don't know. I think we came around to washing the bodies of the dead, and I honestly think that's probably the right place to end. And I guess all I'll say is that, my children aren't old enough to watch Zoom sessions, but hopefully someday they'll stumble on this, and as they're squabbling over who's going to take care of dad in his decrepit old age, hopefully they'll all be inspired by this conversation to actually compete to see who gets to, change my winding sheet in my Floridian decay. So that's where I'll end. And I do want to say that, I think this has been a terrific conversation, and I'm incredibly grateful to all of you for the responses to my essay. So thank you.
Thank you, and thanks to each of you on the panel. I'll have to remember this Zoom conversation and put it away so my kids watch it in 30 years.
50, surely. 50, Peter.
50, yes, okay. And thanks to each of our speakers and for your various writings, to our audience for some excellent questions, and I'm sorry we didn't get to more of them, but we got to a bunch. Again, just remind those of you who came on a little later, if you'd like to be notified of more events like this, please go on the Plough website and you can sign up for our emails, or even better, subscribe to this magazine where you can read contributions from people like our panel and speakers. So thank you, Ross. Thank you, Anna, Sarah, and Leah. And good night to all.